Welcome to Cultivating Victory Live. Today is January 18th, 2018, and I'm here with Glenn Schultz from Schultz Family Farm and Clark Harshbarger from NRCS. Glenn, if you'll go ahead and take it from there.
Thank you, Mary. So I'm here to introduce Clark. Clark is a USDA NRCS resource soil scientist here in Colorado. And we met Clark at one of the local Boulder farms, Golden Hoof, and he is truly a pioneer or a true advocate for soil. He brings a shovel, and we're digging into the soil, looking for earthworms and all the factors we want to see where soil can hold water and nutrients and such.
Thanks, Glenn. So I reside here in Longmont, Colorado, along the Front Range, and my duty location is in Greeley, Colorado, which is located in Weld County. Weld County is the largest producing agricultural county in the state of Colorado, and is across the country. It's very large in production. So I see through my job a lot of scale. So we have beef confinements and dairy confinement operations, and we have large pivot circles all across the landscapes, and it's a very a very large production scale area. And the neat part about my current position is I also get to see small scale farming. And so when we met in Boulder, we were kind of on that extreme as far as the types of producers I get to work with. And my job is based on the ability to convey the importance of soils in our agricultural systems, but as a platform and really everything we do in society. So from neighborhood development, from city water usage, all the way to just educating our children about the life and the hidden half of nature, as Dr. Montgomery would say, that exists in our soil. So I feel like I have one of the best jobs in the USDA, no doubt, because my whole job is to promote something I feel very passionate about, and I think is critically important, a paradigm shift that we need to undergo in both our agriculture and in our communities, to put soils back as the platform of our decision making and in our farm systems. So I guess I would like to share a video with you that brought me and alarmed me. So let's see if I can pull this up again and see if I can get it to play for you. So this is a very common process, and as Mary would know, in New Mexico and all across the western United States and the Great Plains, wind erosion is a very natural process. And so one thing I've realized, even as humans, I'm like, we don't live on the earth, we live in the earth. And even that paradigm in itself, I think, helps people understand that what we do to the planet is in direct relation to us as humans, and then of course our children. And I have twin sons, and so once you get on into that relationship with the next generation, you really see things through a different lens. And so that's kind of where I'm at with my career now, is really trying to yes, use soils as the building block as my talking point, but to really understand the ecological premise of humans, our relationship to animals, those relationships to the plants that they eat and the plants that we grow and consume, and how to actually make holistic decisions, knowing that everything that we do has a cause and effect on other things that exist in our ecosystem.
Clark, you had mentioned that there was baseline soil samples out there for Weld County and in all the counties really in the United States, and one of your jobs is kind of going out there and verifying, are those base samples the same or have changed? Can you elaborate on what you discovered there?
So in Boulder County specifically, they wrote a reconnaissance soil survey as early as 1930. And so they had scientists, geographers, agronomists draw landform-based maps. And the landform-based maps would basically it's basically an inventory of the natural resources. These are how deep the soils are before you get to a rock. This is where the water tables are. These are the plant communities that exist on these landforms. And in this, I think it was in the 70s or 80s, they actually wrote an official soil survey that would be a legal document that we've now allocated almost on every private county in the lower 48 states. And then so from those two documents, we've definitely, there's definitely a trend where the soils are degrading, and you can see that in the depth of the horizons to the diagnostic layers, and those are the layers in the soils that form under natural processes. To the common person, they would see an increase in clay, and so those are an increase in carbonates, and you can see these in the layers in the soils actually getting closer to the surfaces. And so with our project we did last summer, we tried to just go out and say, regardless of what happened from 1930 through 1980 to 2017, let's lay down some benchmark data, and now let's implement some of these regenerative practices. And from here going forward, let's see, are we storing more carbon? Are we able to infiltrate water and get it to percolate to deeper zones? Can we break through some of these compaction layers with our crop rotations and our practices that we choose maybe to implement a cover crop or a grazing system to actually get the roots and shapes and sizes to get into a deeper horizon and be able to start to mine the soils to pull those minerals back up for sequential crops in those rotations. So that's some of the work I've been doing with the Boulder County Open Space and on private and both public management.
So Clark, what kind of resistance do you see when you talk to people about what's going on in the soil?
Well, that's a very good question, because sometimes it's hard to get out of your comfort zone or out of maybe your tribe or like-minded thinkers. I try to just give people a real basic understanding. So let me show a screen. And so I try to get people to understand where they're at. When I'm talking to maybe customers that aren't involved in what we would call maybe a regenerative system, just try to use common language. So I try to say, who here wants to use your free resources? We have the sun, we have the air in the atmosphere, the air in our soils. Most of our producers obviously buy their land or lease their land. So they're paying for that land, but the actual resource of the microbiological community that's in those soils isn't accounted for typically in the price of that land. So I like to think of it as a free resource, or water. Those are the free resources. So that's like where I start when I talk with producers that haven't maybe begun this awakening or this journey. And so that to me is key, is that they understand that the language I'm speaking is a universal language. It's a common language that's going to benefit everybody. And so some of the resistance we'll get, well, I don't have the labor or the time. And so this is really exciting. One thing we're doing now in Boulder specifically, we're actually going to launch a targeted conservation proposal to actually help producers implement these practices with cost sharing. And so it's the big umbrella is called EQIP, and that's the environmental quality program through the NRCS. But we're actually going to take a group of funding there and say, if folks are willing to implement what we're deeming a soil health management system on any parcels of land, then we're actually going to be able to take concentrated funding from that pool and give it to producers to help them transition to maybe ease some of that resistance or help them, transition. And so I can talk a little bit about the soil health management system. What that really is just a combination of practices to tune into these resources. And so we're trying to get them to meet our soil health principles, which are not even cited by any one agency or any one doctor or researcher, but they're actually just principles that we see in nature. The age-old principle with the NRCS since that Dust Bowl was residue management. And so we still use that as one of the main principles, and it's just to keep the soil covered. Alan Savory will use that also in holistic management. And so when you have these different NGOs, non-government organizations, agreeing with what we're saying with the agency is, we need to keep our soils covered. A bare soil is hungry, naked, thirsty, and running a temperature, as Ray Archuleta, said so elegantly. And so we've got to keep them covered. So we create habitat. And so that and protect habitat for the microbes and create environments that's going to foster our crops. And so that keeping the soil covered is critical. And so I ask producers to look at maybe a 3-year calendar. And I say, in every month, how are you going to meet this principle with your management skills, your labor, and with the practices you choose? And so I really try to put it into a system where they can start to see maybe windows of opportunities. And it's challenging. This isn't an easy task, especially in the semi-arid West, where we're fringing on a desert, and a lot of our land, frankly, has been desertified or is in a degradation state. And so we have obstacles to overcome. And so we have a big challenge at our hand to basically speak a common language. And I feel that's where soils are a perfect resource to do that. So these principles are very, very self-explanatory. Disturbing the soil as little as possible. When we harvest our carrots, potatoes, radishes, there's a disturbance to the soil, and that's okay. That's the soil is a resource we've been given. We have to understand there's a give back, and so that second principle, disturbing the soil as little as possible, can be done with technology. It can be done with using different practices. One would be cover cropping or mulching, passive solarization, and that gets to the third principle, is to keep a living root. One thing that we kind of have as a misnomer is when we crop is we have what we call frost-free days. And so our frost-free days was a language that we spoke and we talked to producers through the NRCS for a lot of years, was that you had a window, say, again, and for instance, in Boulder County, from May 15th to September 15th to get a crop harvested, right? And that was where you needed to do. You needed to have your field tilled, you needed to have it prepped, and you needed to have it seeded by those dates to make a warm season crop. But what we're finding out now is nature isn't behaving by those rules. We're having growing degree days, which are different than frost-free days, all the way into December. Glenn, I know you farm here in Boulder County, and you saw windows of opportunities well through the month of November on your farm, right? And so these are ideas that we're trying to capture is when you harvest that warm season crop, what are you going to do to be able to keep that living root so you can keep that energy flow? That's why I feel like this diagram here is so important. You see the sun, and it goes into the producer. Well, the producer are our plants. And then you keep that energy flow from the producers to the decomposers, and those are the microbes in the soil, in the fungal groups, and the different kingdoms we have with the actinomycetes and archaea and things that are well beyond my knowledge of expertise. And then you have that energy flow back from the consumers, which are our herbivores and our carnivores, which humans make up, but also our goats and sheep and cows. And that whole, that whole cycle is in flow. So once you harness that cycle in your farming system, you really can start to build what we're trying to deem as a regenerative system. And it's challenging, but it can be done.
The challenge I have in what you said, and I've got ditch water that runs, kind of off within that growing season. So I need some ideas and what do I put in that doesn't take as much water, because my irrigation is now very limited really to city water. If I get any water at all, I'd have to then use city water at that point.
Yeah, so one idea resource professionals came up with the West, especially in Montana, I think is where one of the first states that caught on was this concept of fallowing. We've found that fallowing doesn't meet that principle of keeping the living root. But I think, it's a misnomer, but I want as producers to start to think about that in the semi-arid West, these windows of opportunity, say from September 30th to November 30th may not have dependable either ditch water or precipitation. And so we need to start thinking about our farms as areas where we can actually dedicate our whole season to these soils. So you may have a grid, field 1, field 2, field 3, or in a row system, row 1, row 2, row 3, where that row, say row 2, in between row 1 and row 3, would actually be dedicated to giving back to the soil for the whole growing season. It's a little bit of a paradigm shift. They do it in vineyards, where you have perennial rows or whatnot, but it can be done in annual cropping systems. Minor Morgan just came to Longmont. He farms in the Albuquerque area and showed how he does it. And he dedicates 3 years in that row 2 for an annual cover crop. And then on the fourth season, he'll move it. So row 1 will then become managed like row 2, and then vice versa. So the evens would get the annual cover crops, and the odds would be the production rows. And he does that for a 3-year cycle. So our culture, the Western culture, we are an extractive culture. We're a taking culture. I had my awakening in soil science and with soil health and with basically regenerative farming taught to me from an Apache American Indian in Texas who had been given the role as a farmer in his tribe. And he said, my people, we're givers. We give back the land. And I think adopting some of those practices that our American Indians were using for thousands of years here and farming would behoove us very well to stay in a little bit better balance with our resources that we're given, especially in the arid West. And so just thinking about giving back as we're taking and how you do that within your system is the beauty of the principles of soil health. The principles are few, but the methods are millions. And the only limitation is the human mind. And so how we do this and create markets for yourself and is really the most exciting thing, I think, for farmers like yourself. The Gabe Brown model, Steve Tucker, Jonathan Cobb, these are farmers all across the country that are bringing in multiple revenue streams, not just selling a commodity and dumping it at a commodity price, but creating their own markets to have their insurance built through diversity in the system. And that leads me to the last principle is diversity. You have to have different ways to bring in revenue, whether it be different crops that you grow, different vegetable selections, maybe you produce some seed, maybe you're producing a meat product, a milk or a dairy product, and you're finding windows of opportunities that are not being met by other farmers, or maybe our farmers start to collectivize and come up with cooperative labels. This is happening all over the country. There's example in Modern Farmer. I don't know if you're familiar with that publication, but I think right on the first page, there was a beef producer that in Arkansas that gathered 14 other common like-minded farmers, and now they have a stronger market that they can gain because they're meeting a volume, but each person can still do a regenerative system on scale, and then they meet and they can still gain a return for that that's a lot greater than, say, if they were to go into a commodity or try to have a direct market sale where we know time and labor getting to farmers markets is very difficult and puts a challenging economic model in place too. So I think that's one of the issues. And the last principle, just to cover that, would be incorporating livestock, or what we say they're byproducts. And so it's not so much a direct manure application from a CAFO or from a side, but you actually get that manure, you get it stabilized in a composting system, and then you may apply the compost. Or you put the animals out to graze the cover crop as a forage crop, or you actually are just grazing animals in the garden area. Some of the organic standards, you have to be careful about that 90-day or 120-day limits, but that may be a reason that you don't certify organically, because they're putting limitations to regenerative practices in some cases, that if you have other ways to maintain food safety by washing and making sure that the food is clean for your consumers, you could take some of that into your own hands. But
Christine, I always enjoy listening to some of our guests because we've all followed very different journeys and come to very much the same conclusions, and it keeps coming back to kind of the mindset and the way people are thinking about our land and our soil. We know what to do. you mentioned residue management has been one of the goals since the 1930s, and yet we're not doing it. Okay, what do you see as the forces that are working against doing the right thing?
That's great. And again, I can't say enough about the Savory Institute and what they've been doing. And so in 2016, I believe, a year ago, last fall, they put out a documentary and a whole day's workshop called The Consumer Revolution. And honestly, Mary, I think it's the markets. And so how you can get a good to the market and get a return for it, because the practices, like you said, they're known, but there's a lot of risk bridging the experimentation and the mastery of these practices, and then to make sure that you have a market that's able to receive the goods. And so they put out this documentary and a series of videos called The Consumer Revolution. And I really believe that we need to take more onus, and I say we as a consumer. I currently am not a producer, so I see myself as a consumer. We need to take more onus and responsibility about putting value behind our dollar. The inherent systems that we grow also need to fit ecologically and climatically what we grow. Here in Colorado, we live on a steppe land, which was known as a shortgrass prairie. And the soils formed for literally tens and thousands of years under a prey-predator relationship, perennial grassland. We are under the current paradigm of 100 years or less. And so we as humans need to think a lot longer back into the history of the soils and the history of our ecological systems and mirror them. I personally believe along the Front Range, we should be changing annual crops, warm season crops, back into grasslands and taking the meat production systems and putting them back out. Yes, it's still going to take a water budget. It's still going to take a distribution of water, probably some anthropogenic distribution of that water through canals, through piping, through developing watering points throughout a ranch or out a farmland. But I see it as a very simple solution. You're going to have instant increase in carbon, instant increase in natural water storage, and it also is going to provide a livelihood for farmers to stay in farming. It's just you're going to be raising an animal and raising grasses to actually feed the animal versus a extraction crop, which is what we're currently doing with corn, wheat, barley, sugar beets, and some of the other major crops that we grow. Another one is alfalfa. And so the alfalfa, again, is being extracted and hauled off to the confinement. And so I think we really need to push and challenge those markets as a solution. Farmers are going to grow what they can sell. And that's what I've seen through my experiences. The reason they're in the tunnel vision that they have is because we have created this market stream that, frankly, it's a one-way ticket of taking energy flow off of the land, and it doesn't have a good feedback loop. And so I think putting animals back on the land here, specifically in Colorado, on the Front Range would be a very, very good solution. And we have folks that have done that, but we've always put our rangeland on our unarable land, so that the land that we couldn't till or distribute water canals on, we left that as rangeland. Well, I think we need to look at prime farmland, the land that the NRCS says is the best productive farmland, and we need to put that back in grasses and just see exactly what its potential is. And those may be some of the research questions and areas for county open space, I think, are huge opportunities for us to learn, say, how did this work? And gaining that dollar share. Right now, I believe our farmers market, and this is, I don't know the true economic statistic, but I would garnish from my experience, it's probably less than 1% of the economic money spent out of a household goes to farmers markets, where most of our market is being driven by Kroger, which owns King Super, or Walmart, and that's where the dollar is going. And so we need to gain that dollar in those markets with some of the products that actually can grow in our natural biome here in Colorado. So we need to break that dependence on irrigation. For one, the population growth and urban sprawl is already causing some of those water rights that are actually up for public bid to be unaffordable for farmers. So I don't see it as a long-term solution to use irrigation to grow food here. We may be able to grow it in certain pockets, allow riparian zones, or in areas where there's longer water rights. But as a long-term thinker, which soil scientists have to do because we have to think a long-term in the past, but we need to be thinking about 50 years and 100 years out in some of these solutions. And that's hard for the modern farmer to do because he needs to make a payment to the bank or to a leasee or to keep his energy flow through capital up every season. So some of us that have these research or resource positions need to help them transition. And so I do believe there is a place at what I'm trying to get at for some research, but we should have been doing this 25 years ago, frankly, and asking these questions.
And have we become too disparate in our specialization to where we've got a researcher out here looking at these questions, past and future, but the grower is looking at how can I pay my bills this year?
Definitely. I honestly, to me, if I could do one thing with our children and with our producers, it would just get them to think exactly about that holism. Like, we should never be asking questions in research that doesn't affect the producers and the schools and the communities. And we really need to be asking questions that links everybody together so we can think of practical solutions that everyone can use and benefit from that market being created by the consumer to the farming soil health management system by our producers. And we need to link those together with really basically frank conversations. How do you value your dollar? How do you choose what you value in your life? And I think when we start to put soils and water and human health on the top of that list in every household, we're going to see change. But right now, again, just being frank, I just don't think that's the case.
Well, Clark, thank you so much. We're almost out of time. Just want to give you a minute to sum up anything that you might be able to do to help a grower.
Okay. Can you see the images here on the screen? The first one on the top left is a rhizosheath. Then you start to see some macropores. You see some worm castings. There's different features. And so when I go to work with producers, I try to get them to understand these are the habitats, all these different environments for these critters that are actually can do the work for us. So every decision you make can either positively affect these habitats or negatively affect these habitats. So I really try to get people to touch the soil and smell the soil. And I have a lot of hope. I have a lot of hope because I have children and I have to, because there has to be a better world and a better way.